Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for your invitation and for giving me the opportunity to say a few words about Europe here in London in this very special period of time, and to see some good old friends here. I am aware of your group's continuing interest in this topic, and suppose I will not be blowing against the wind in front of this audience. Europe, or perhaps better to say the European Union, has been also my interest and topic for many years. In my views, I was also influenced by Margaret Thatcher and by her fight for freedom and against ever closer, which means undemocratic Europe. Many people in Europe, not the Bruges Group people, have not paid sufficient attention to the developments on our continent until very recently, or haven't dared look at them critically or analytically. Some of them started to pay closer attention to the European problems 2 years ago, in the moment of the explicit, visible, and evidently undeniable Eurozone debt crisis. But most of them still do not want to know that this crisis is only the tip of a much bigger iceberg. They, together with their politicians and most of economists, considered even the 2008-2009 crisis a global phenomenon, which Europe innocently imported from outside, even though it was evident that this was a European and North American crisis, not a global one. The long-lasting problems in Europe have been widely underestimated, and that's the reason why we should put it into the proper historical perspective. European integration was originally based on a rational idea to liberalize Europe, to open it up, to eliminate various kinds of barriers which existed at the borders of European countries, to expand trade by establishing a free trade zone and a customs union, and by building a common market and a large interconnected economic space. It is probably necessary to say explicitly that the original idea was not to liberalize the economic and social system in individual European countries. This liberalization activity more or less characterized the first decades of the European integration process. This brought some positive results, especially as compared to the 1930s. Nevertheless, I suppose most of you would agree that the current era is different. European integration moved to a different stage. The overall liberalization and removal of inter-country barriers were replaced by a massive shift of competencies from individual member states to the European Union's commanding heights in Brussels. By the radical switch from intergovernmentalism to supranationalism. By the intentional and carefully organized weakening of the meaning and cohesion of the original building blocks of European integration of individual European countries. By an overall wide-ranging shift towards European governance, and by large-scale centralization, anti-market regulation, standardization, and harmonization of the whole continent. In the past, a spontaneously created, highly heterogeneous European continent flourished due to its diversity, to its non-uniformity, and to the existing and healthy systemic competition among countries. This changed when Europe became unified and artificially made uniform by a centrally organized governance and legislation. It led to the very disturbing economic outcomes we see around and to what is called a democratic deficit or a lack of democratic accountability. I call it post-democracy. The present-day institutional uniformity turned into a straitjacket which keeps blocking all kinds of positive human activities. The most important moment in this process was the establishment of the European Monetary Union and the introduction of one currency in a group of originally 12, now 17 countries that evidently do not form what the economists call an optimal currency area. The undergoing Eurozone debt crisis is an inevitable consequence of one currency, one exchange rate, and one interest rate for countries with very diverse economic parameters. The political decision, and it was a strictly and exclusively political decision in favor of this arrangement, was taken without almost any attention being paid to the existing economic fundamentals. The economists know that non-optimal, which means wrongly constructed monetary unions, are costly and do not last long. Such arrangements may be hypothetically saved by a high degree of solidarity among their members and by huge fiscal transfers. But there is no, and there can't be any truly authentic feeling of solidarity in Europe, which existed, for example, in Germany after its unification at the beginning of the 1990s. And there is no, from heavens falling, large volume of funds in the hands of the supranational political authorities to compensate the countries which are, because of their economic parameters, the victims of such an arrangement. Due to it, there is, in my view, no imminent solution to the Eurozone sovereign debt trap. There are only very unpleasant consequences: short-term economic and budgetary problems and long-term stagnation. Some people dream about the forthcoming acceleration of economic growth. It is difficult, if not impossible, to find any reason for such a magic acceleration of growth to occur in Europe. On the contrary, most EU countries must make fiscal cuts, not fiscal expansions, and not only in the short term, but at least in the medium term as well. And in the long run, Keynes famously said, we are all dead. The current European unification construct or model is, however, only half of the whole problem. In addition to the difficulties resulting from the integration itself, there is a huge problem with the European economic and social system, with the European soziale Marktwirtschaft. It is much better to say it in German than in English. because the European soziale Marktwirtschaft prefers social policy based on income redistribution to productive activities. It prefers leisure, free time, and long holidays to hard work. It prefers consumption to investments, debt to savings, and security to risk-taking. It prefers social democratism to capitalism. This economic and social model is part of a broader civilizational and cultural framework which is already deeply rooted in Europe or in most of its countries. It can't be abandoned easily. It can't be corrected by painless or cosmetic palliative measures. It can't be changed as a result of one or another EU summit. To make Europe functional and productive again requires a deep systemic change, something structurally similar to the task we had to accomplish more than 2 decades ago in the Czech Republic, when we tried to get rid of communism and its legacy. When I mentioned for the first time the term Czech Republic, I hope that at least some of you know that the Czech Republic still uses its own currency. We were sufficiently and in advance aware of the difficulties connected with the wrongly constructed model of a monetary union. We wanted to continue our much-needed overall adjustment processes with sufficient adjustment capabilities, which requires our own flexible exchange rate, our own interest rates, and our own monetary policies. We do not find, and we didn't find, any advantage in using neither the German nor Greek exchange and interest rates. For the time being, we don't have any plans to enter the Eurozone. Just as a remark, last week's opinion poll in the Czech Republic indicated that only 19% of Czechs want to join the Eurozone sometimes in the future. 76% say no, 76%, and 5% say that they don't know. So this, with all the believing or not believing in the opinion polls, I think that the basic figures are quite clear and significant. As I said, the escaping from the current European crisis needs a fundamental systemic change, which means at least 2 things: the transformation of the European social and economic system, and the restructuring of the European institutional or political arrangement, in another terminology, the form of the European integration. I am convinced that both things are of the same importance. Let me tentatively suggest the main components of such a change. I have 8 points which I will try to suggest. First, we have to get rid of the unproductive and paternalistic soziale Marktwirtschaft, augmented, which means further undermined by the growing role of the green ideology. That's my suggestion number 1. I must make a special remark. When I made similar ideas months ago in Germany, in Dresden, 1,200 people coming from the CDU, Christian Democratic Union in Germany, together with the Prime Minister of Saxony and all the leading politicians. When I said that sentence, there was a huge applause. And I said, I am absolutely shocked. I didn't expect that you in Germany would applaud exactly that sentence, which is, for me, relatively interesting and maybe, hopefully, significant. So that's the first point, to get rid of the soziale Marktwirtschaft. Second, we should accept, our politicians should accept, that the economic adjustment processes take time and that the impatient politicians and governments usually make things worse. The politicians shouldn't try to mastermind the markets, to micromanage the economy, to produce growth by government stimuli and incentives. So let the market function. Point number 3. We should start making comprehensive reductions of government expenditures and forget flirting with solutions based on tax increases. Interesting, in Great Britain the applause is after tax increases, and that's interesting. These reductions, these budgetary reductions, must dominantly deal with mandatory expenditures, because discretionary spending cuts are, as a long-term solution, quantitatively more or less insignificant. Number 4. We should stop the creeping but constantly expanding green legislation. The Greens must be stopped from taking over much of our economy under the banner of such flawed ideas as the global warming doctrine. Number 5. We should get rid of the centralization, harmonization, standardization of the European continent, and after half a century of such measures, start decentralizing, deregulating, and desubsidizing our society and economy. Number 6. We should make it possible for countries which are the victims of the European Monetary Union to leave it and to return to their own monetary arrangements. That's for me absolutely crucial, but it's necessary to stress to make it possible for the countries, which means hypothetically to help them in this respect. Number 7, we should forget such plans or projects as a European fiscal union, not to speak about ostentatively anti-democratic ambitions to politically unify Europe. And my final point, we should return to democracy, which can exist only at the level of nation states, not at the level of the whole continent. It requires returning from supranationalism to intergovernmentalism. those are my 8 points. And again, I mentioned my recent speech in Germany. And some time ago, I didn't have 8, but just 6 points in Washington, D.C., in one of the Republican think tanks in the U.S. And I spoke about Europe. And what was very interesting, that someone from the first row was the first to ask a question. Well, it's not just for Europe. It's for the United States as well, such a program to do. So I hope a serious discussion of these issues I talked about will finally begin in Europe. Thank you for your attention.